The letter lay on the table between them like a thing already dead. It was sealed in black wax, though no one in the house had died, and Lady Helena Ashby understood, before a single word was read aloud, that the wax had been chosen for effect. Edmund Ashby, 5th Duke of Marrow, did not waste gestures. He sat across from her in the long library at Marrow Court, his hands folded with the stillness of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and the fire behind him burned low and grudging, as though even the flames had learned not to draw attention to themselves in his presence. Rain moved against the windows in long grey sheets. It had rained for 3 days, and the gardens beyond the glass had gone the colour of old iron. "You will remove to the Dower house," the Duke said, "by the end of the month." It was not a question. Helena had learned, in the 18 months since her husband's death, that the Ashby man did not ask questions when a statement would do the work more efficiently and crush more thoroughly. She looked at the letter without touching it. She did not need to break the seal to know its contents. She had heard the substance of it 3 times already, in 3 different rooms, phrased with 3 different degrees of false regret. The estate could not continue to support a widow's household at Marrow Court. The Dower house at Ashbourne, 6 miles distant, stood empty and would suit her circumstances. A small staff would be retained. Her allowance would be reviewed. "The Dower house has not been opened in 11 years, she said. "Then you shall have the pleasure of opening it." There was in his voice something almost like amusement, though his face showed none of it. Edmund Ashby was a handsome man in the manner of a winter morning, all clean lines and cold light, and he had perfected, over the course of his life, the particular cruelty of never raising his voice. He did not need to. The size of the house did that for him, and the size of his patience, which was vast, and the knowledge, shared by every soul on the estate, that he had buried his elder brother only a year and a half before, and had not once been seen to weep. Helena rose. She smoothed her skirts with hands that did not shake, though she would allow them to shake later, alone, in the privacy of her room, where no Ashby eyes could record the moment as a victory. She had learned that much from her husband, in the brief years she had been given him, that grief, displayed, became a weapon in another's hand, and that the only safety lay in holding it close, like a coal carried inside a closed fist, burning quietly, hurting no one but oneself. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that he wanted her gone, not because the house could not support her, for the house could have supported a dozen widows and never noticed the expense, but because she made him uneasy in a way he could not name, even to himself. She had seen it in the small ways he avoided her eyes at dinner. She had seen it in the way he asked, too often, too carelessly, whether she had found anything among her late husband's effects, papers, ledgers, the ordinary clutter of a man's desk, and whether she had read any of it. She always answered that she had not. This, of every falsehood she had told in her life, was the one she told most easily, because she had practiced it the longest, and because the truth it concealed was the only thing of value she still possessed. The Dower house, when she arrived at it 3 weeks later, in a closed carriage with 2 trunks and a single maid, looked less like a residence than like a memory that the world had forgotten to demolish. Ivy had taken the east wall entire, climbing in over the lintels and forcing the shutters from their hinges. The drive was a track of mud and old gravel, half swallowed by grass gone to seed. Somewhere behind the house she could hear water, a stream perhaps, or the slow drip of a gutter long since given up to ruin. And the air smelled of wet stone and something sweeter beneath it, something that might once have been roses. She stood in the weed-choked forecourt for a long moment before she let herself be helped down. Her maid, a quiet girl named Susan, with a face too young for the disapproval it wore, looked up at the dark windows and said nothing, which Helena appreciated more than she could have said. There was no use in voicing what they both saw. The house had been left to die slowly, the way certain men leave certain inconvenient relations to die slowly. by withdrawal of attention, rather than by any single decisive blow, and it would have died in time had no one come to interrupt the process. She walked to the door herself. The key, when it finally turned, screamed in the lock like something startled out of a long sleep, and the hall beyond exhaled a breath of cold, mouldering air that made Susan cough and step back. Helena did not step back. She went in. It was, she would tell herself later, the worst night of a year that had contained a great many bad nights, though it would be unfair to call it the worst night entirely on its own terms, since the rooms were merely empty and ruined, and emptiness and ruin, compared to what she had already survived, were almost restful in their honesty. She and Susan slept that first night in the one chamber with an intact roof, on a mattress they had brought with them, beneath a window through which the stars showed clear and uncaring, and Helena lay awake long after the girl's breathing had slowed into sleep, listening to the house creak and settle around her, like an old animal arranging itself for rest. She thought that night of her husband. She allowed herself, in the dark, the indulgence she denied herself by daylight. She let his face come to her, not as it had been in the last week of his life, pale and strange and already half departed, but as it had been 3 years before, laughing at something she no longer remembered, his hand warm over hers at a dinner table in a house that no longer welcomed her. Julian Ashby had been nothing like his brother, where Edmund was ice arranged into the shape of a man. Julian had been warmth itself, careless and generous and entirely unsuited, his friends had always said, to the cold machinery of a great estate's management. And yet it had been Julian, in the final months of his life, who had begun asking quiet questions about the estate's accounts. Julian, who had grown thin and watchful and had stopped laughing at dinner. Julian, who had ridden out one grey morning on a horse he had ridden 1,000 times before, and had been brought back across that same horse's saddle by men who could not quite meet his wife's eyes when they told her how he had fallen. She had not believed it then, she did not believe it now. But belief, without proof, was only grief wearing the costume of suspicion, and she had nothing, not yet, to set against the official account of an unfortunate accident on a wet road. She had only a feeling, sharp as a blade beneath the ribs, that her husband had found something he should not have found, and that he had died for it, and that his brother, who now occupied his house and his title and his fortune with such serene and unhurried confidence, had perhaps known more about the manner of that finding than any man ought to know about his own brother's death. She closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, in the ruin of what had once been a garden, something moved through the undergrowth with a soft, deliberate rustle and was gone. In the morning, the Dower house looked smaller and sadder by daylight, the way certain failures do. But Helena had already decided, somewhere in the grey hour before dawn, that she would not be permitted the luxury of despair. Despair was a thing the Ashby men could afford. It cost them nothing and changed nothing in their lives. She, on the other hand, had been given exactly 6 rooms, a leaking roof, a garden gone entirely to bramble, and an allowance that would not, by her own quiet calculation, stretch to cover even the most modest repairs. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to those who have nothing left to lose, that the Duke had not given her a house at all. He had given her a problem, in the hope that the problem would consume her, and that she would either retreat to some distant cottage on her own diminished means, or else exhaust herself entirely in the attempt to make the place habitable, and trouble him no further either way. She walked the garden first. It seemed, somehow, the more urgent task, though any reasonable person would have told her the roof wanted attention before the roses did. But there was something in the tangle of green that called to her, a sense of order beneath the chaos, old beds still discernible under their blanket of bramble and bindweed, a stone path half buried but unmistakably a path, leading from the terrace down toward what had once, long ago, been a rose garden of some ambition. She found, beneath the worst of the growth, the skeletal remains of an arbour, its ironwork rusted nearly through, and beneath that, choked almost to death, but not quite. A climbing rose whose old wood was thick as a man's wrist. Proof that whatever hand had planted with real love and real patience decades before. She knelt beside it in the wet grass, indifferent to her gown, and began, with her bare hands, to clear the bindweed from its base. She was still there an hour later when old Tam found her. He had been gardener at the Dower house, he told her, in the days when the last dowager had lived there, old Tam, who must have been 70 if he was a day, with hands like the roots of the very plants he tended, and a manner so blunt it bordered on insolence, though Helena found she did not mind it. He stood at the edge of the ruined bed, looking down at her with an expression of frank disbelief. "You'll ruin your hands," he said, by way of greeting. "They are already ruined," Helena said, not looking up. "What sort of rose is this?" He was quiet for a moment, studying the thick old wood with something that might, in a less weathered face, have passed for tenderness. "Ashbourne damask," he said at last. "Bred here, this garden, 60 year back, near enough. There's none other like it in the county. Used to send cuttings as far as London in the old days." He paused. "Thought it dead myself. Most things in this garden, I thought, dead." "It isn't dead," Helena said. "It only wants someone to clear the weeds from around it." Old Tam looked at her for a long moment, and something passed across his face that Helena would only understand much later, when she had come to know him better, as the particular respect a man who has spent his life with growing things reserves for another who understands, instinctively, that nothing worth having survives by being left alone. "Aye," he said, "don't we all?" He stayed the better part of that first morning, though he had not been asked to, and would, by his own later admission, have found a dozen reasons to refuse had Helena pressed him on it. He showed her where the old beds had run, tracing their lines through the bramble with a stick, the way another man might have drawn a map from memory, and named for her, as they went, the plants that might yet be saved beneath the ruin, and those that were, in his blunt estimation, beyond any hand's recovery. He spoke little of himself, and nothing at all, that first day, of why he had remained in the parish so long after the Dower house had ceased to require a gardener's wages. But Helena noticed, before the morning was out, the particular gentleness with which he handled even the most thoroughly strangled of the old rose canes, as though each one were an old friend whose neglect he had been powerless until now to prevent. And she understood, without being told, that he had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and make the waiting worthwhile. The first months were a campaign waged in small increments, the way all real campaigns are waged, by people without armies. Helena had her trunks, her widow's settlement, meagre but not nothing, and the particular ferocity of a woman who has been underestimated by every man in her life and has decided, somewhere in the privacy of her own heart, that she has finished being underestimated. She sold 3 gowns she did not need and bought slate for the worst of the roof. She traded needlework, fine, patient, exquisite needlework, the one accomplishment her finishing had given her that proved, against all expectation, to have a market value, to the wife of the local solicitor in exchange for the loan of 2 men to clear the worst of the rubble from the east wing. She wrote, in a hand so careful it betrayed nothing of the fury beneath it, to every tenant farmer and tradesman within 10 miles whom her husband had once treated kindly, reminding them gently of his memory and asking, in terms that left them every freedom to refuse, whether they might spare a day's labour or a load of timber in exchange for whatever small service she could offer in return. Edmund, when word of these activities reached him, and it reached him quickly, for the county was small and gossip travelled faster than any letter, sent a note expressing his hope that she was settling in comfortably and reduced her allowance by a further quarter, citing economies necessitated by a poor harvest. Helena read the letter twice, folded it precisely in half, and used the back of it to write out a list of repairs still wanting attention. She did not reply. She had learned that silence, deployed correctly, unsettled him more than any protest could have done, because protest gave him something to manage, and silence gave him nothing at all. It was old Tam who first noticed the dog. He came to the kitchen door one grey afternoon in early autumn, his cap in his hands, an expression on his weathered face that Helena had not seen there before, something between alarm and a reluctant, suspicious wonder. "There's a hound out by the old kennel wall," he said. "Big grey brute, deerhound by the look of him, near starved. Sat there an hour just looking at the house. I went to chase him off and he wouldn't go, just looked at me." Helena's hands stilled over the mending in her lap. "What colour is his collar?" Tam frowned. "Brass buckle, worn leather." "Why?" She was on her feet before he had finished speaking, moving through the kitchen and out into the cold afternoon with a speed that astonished even her. And there, exactly as Tam had described, sitting with the patient, unmoving dignity of an animal that has travelled a very long way and intends to wait as long as it must, was Caesar, Julian's old deerhound who had been left, after his master's death, in the kennels at Marrow Court, and whom Helena had not seen, nor thought of with any hope of seeing again, in 18 months. She knelt in the wet grass. The dog rose, stiff and thin, his grey muzzle nearly white now where it had once been merely silvered, and crossed the distance between them with the unhurried gravity of an old friend arriving precisely on time, and put his great head against her shoulder, and she put her arms around his neck and wept for the first time since her husband's funeral, openly, without restraint, while old Tam stood a respectful distance off and pretended, with great tact, to be examining the state of the kennel wall. "He must have walked it," she said, when she could speak again. 6 miles, more by the road. "Dogs remember," Tam said simply, "more than some folk give them credit for." He came again the next week, and the week after that, until it became understood, without anyone deciding it formally, that Caesar now lived at the Dower house, slipping his confinement at Marrow Court with a regularity that maddened the Duke's kennel master and delighted, in quiet ways, everyone else who heard of it. Helena did not send him back. She told herself this was practical. The house wanted a guard, and the Duke's stables could certainly spare one aging hound. But she knew, in the part of herself she shared with no one, that the dog's return felt like something closer to a sign, the kind of small, stubborn mercy the world occasionally permits itself, as if to apologize, briefly, for everything else it has taken. She had not yet found what she was looking for. She had searched the desk Julian had used at Marrow Court before her removal, and found nothing. She had searched her own trunks, and the small box of his personal effects the Duke's solicitor had grudgingly released to her, and found nothing there either, beyond a watch, a signet ring she could not bring herself to wear, and a single letter from a man in London whose name meant nothing to her, thanking Julian for his inquiry and promising to send the requested figures by the next post. The figures, whatever they had been, had never reached her. She suspected they had reached Julian, briefly, in the last weeks of his life, and that, wherever they had gone afterward, they had not gone where his brother could find them. Because if they had, she reasoned, lying awake with Caesar's great weight warm against her feet, Edmund would not still be so careful, so watchful, so determined to see her established somewhere small and forgettable, and far from anywhere a determined woman might think to look. She began that winter to wonder whether her husband had hidden something here. The Dower house had been his idea originally. She remembered now, turning the memory over with new attention, how he had spoken of it once, in the last spring of his life, with an odd particularity, asking whether she had ever seen the old rose garden there, telling her that his grandmother had loved it, that there was a stone in it, somewhere near the arbour, that marked the spot where the first damask had been planted, and that he meant to take her there himself one day, when matters at the estate were settled. Matters at the estate had never been settled. He had died before he could take her anywhere at all. She began, in the bitter early mornings of that winter, to dig. The county did not expect to find the Dower house transformed within the space of a single year, and Helena gave it no reason to expect anything at all, for she went about her work with the quiet, unannounced persistence of a woman who has decided that recognition is a luxury she will purchase later, with results, rather than borrow now on credit with promises. The slate roof, mended section by section as funds permitted, no longer wept into the upper chambers. The east wing, cleared of its rubble, became first a single habitable room, and then, by careful stages, 3. Susan was joined by a second maid, the daughter of a tenant farmer whose family Julian had once helped through a hard winter, and who came to the Dower house not for wages, which were modest, but for the particular loyalty that memory of a kindness inspires in those who do not forget kindnesses easily. But it was the garden that the county noticed first, because gardens, unlike repaired roofs, announce themselves to the eye from a considerable distance, and because Helena had given the garden the whole of her own labour, in a manner no lady of her birth was strictly expected to do, and had found, in the doing of it, something she had not expected to find at all. A kind of peace that came only from work undertaken with her own hands, dirt under her nails, the ache of effort in her back and shoulders, standing in for the ache she could not otherwise express. By the second spring, the old damask roses along the south wall had been freed entirely from their bramble, pruned with Tam's careful guidance, fed and mulched and coaxed back into the kind of vigour that had not been seen at the Dower house in a generation. And when they bloomed, and they bloomed extravagantly, as though making up for years of neglect in a single defiant season, word of it travelled through the county with the particular speed reserved for beautiful things in a world starved for beauty. The vicar's wife came first, ostensibly to inquire after Helena's health, and stayed an hour longer than courtesy required, walking the restored paths with an expression of frank astonishment. The solicitor's wife came next, then the wife of a baronet from the far side of the river. Then, and this Helena noted with a private, unspoken satisfaction she allowed herself only after the visitor had gone, the wife of a man who sat in the House of Commons and kept a country seat 11 miles distant, who declared, loudly enough that it was repeated in 3 different drawing rooms within the week, that she had never in her life seen damask roses of such quality, and demanded to know where she might obtain cuttings. Helena gave her cuttings. She gave cuttings that summer to anyone who asked, and many who did not quite dare to ask but hovered near the south wall with an unmistakable longing, because she had begun to understand something her husband's family had never understood at all. That generosity, freely offered, builds a kind of fortune no inheritance can touch, and that a woman with nothing but a ruined house and a damask rose had, within 2 years, become someone whose acquaintance the county actively sought, while the Duke, who had banished her there, sat in his great cold house and grew, by slow degrees, more isolated than he had ever intended her to be. It was at this point, with the roses established, the house half restored, and her own small reputation quietly, stubbornly ascending, that Helena's aunt arrived without warning, in a hired carriage entirely too grand for the Dower house's modest drive, and announced herself before she had even properly descended. "Well," said Mrs. Prudence Thorne, surveying the restored garden with an expression of considerable approval, and the south facade of the house with rather less, "I see you have been busy ruining your complexion and saving your fortune, in roughly that order. Don't trouble to deny it, I can see the proof on your hands." Helena, laughing for what felt like the first time in months, embraced her aunt with genuine warmth. Prudence Thorne was her late mother's younger sister, a widow herself, twice over, with a tongue sharp enough to cut glass, and a heart, beneath it, soft enough that she had spent the better part of her own modest fortune on causes and relations she considered deserving, and never once mentioned the expense aloud. She had been abroad, in Italy, nursing a dying friend through a long, final illness, and had returned to England only that month to find, via the gossip of 3 separate acquaintances, that her niece had been cast out to a ruin and had, in Prudence's own delighted phrase, had the supreme good taste to make something of it instead of dying decoratively, as that family clearly hoped. They did not hope I would die, Helena said. No, Prudence agreed, settling herself into the one good chair the drawing room now boasted, with the air of a general taking command of new territory. They hoped you would disappear, which is a slower and more genteel form of the same wish. Tell me everything. Begin with the Duke, since I gather he is the villain of the piece, and do not spare me a single detail of his unpleasantness. I have been starved of good gossip for the better part of a year, and I intend to make up the deficit at once. Helena told her, not everything, not yet, for the matter of the buried proof and Julian's death was a confidence too dangerous to share, even with so trusted an aunt, until she had something solid to set beside it. But enough. The Dower house, the reduced allowance, the small cruelties accumulated like sediment over 2 years, each one negligible alone and devastating in aggregate. Prudence listened with her lips pressed into a thin, considering line, and when Helena had finished, she said only, "He has made a grave error." "In sending me here?" "In imagining," Prudence said, "that a woman with nothing left to lose is a woman without power. It is, in my experience, precisely the opposite. The women society fears most are the ones who have already survived its worst and have discovered, on the other side of survival, that they no longer require its good opinion to be content. You, my dear, have become one of those women, whether you intended it or not, and I should think the Duke would do well to notice it before it costs him something he values." Helena said nothing to this, though she thought, that night, of the loose stone she had found 3 weeks before, half buried beneath the largest of the damask roses, marked with a chiselled rose no larger than a coin, the very marker, she was now nearly certain, that Julian had once described to her, the spot where the first cutting of the Ashbourne damask had been planted, generations before either of them had been born. She had not yet had the courage, or perhaps simply the opportunity, to disturb the earth beneath it. But she would. If you have followed this far and found yourself drawn into Helena's quiet war, you might consider staying a while longer. There is a button, somewhere near this very screen, that costs nothing and means a great deal to those of us who tell these stories. Now, back to the garden and the stone and what lay beneath it. She waited until a night when Susan and the younger maid had gone to bed, and Tam had returned to his own cottage, and Caesar lay stretched before the kitchen fire with the deep, untroubled sleep of an old dog who has finally come home. She took a lantern and a small trowel and went out into the garden alone, where the damask roses stood heavy with late summer bloom, their scent thick and sweet in the cooling air, and knelt beside the marked stone and began, carefully, to dig. It took longer than she expected, and twice she stopped, certain she had heard a footstep on the gravel path behind her, and twice found nothing there but the wind moving through the climbing rose on the old arbour. The earth beneath the stone was packed hard, undisturbed for years, but 18 inches down her trowel struck something that was not soil. A small iron box, no larger than a writing case, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle with age, but dry within, remarkably dry, as though whoever had buried it had taken great care that it should survive whatever came after. She carried it inside with hands that shook now, openly, with no one left to see and therefore no need to disguise the shaking, and set it on the kitchen table, and broke the small lock with the same trowel she had used to dig it free, and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, a dozen sheets closely written in a hand she recognized at once as her husband's, and beneath them, copies of letters bearing the seal of a London banking house, and beneath those, a ledger, smaller than the estate's official accounts, but unmistakably authentic, recording in Julian's own careful figures a pattern of disbursements from the estate's tenant rents over a period of nearly 4 years. Disbursements that did not appear, she would discover upon comparing them later with the estate's published accounts. In any ledger that had ever been shown to a solicitor, a magistrate, or a single living soul beyond the man who had drawn them off, and the brother who had, it seemed, been receiving them. There was a final sheet, dated 3 days before Julian's death, written in a hand less steady than his usual, as though composed in haste or in fear, or both. She read it twice before she could make herself believe what it said. Her husband had discovered that his brother had, for years, been diverting tenant rents intended for the estate's improvement into a private account in London, while reporting losses to their father's solicitors that did not exist. He had discovered, further, that 2 tenant families had been evicted on the pretense of arrears that had, in truth, been paid in full and simply never recorded. And he had written, in the last line of that last page, in a hand that pressed hard enough into the paper to leave a faint shadow on the sheet beneath it, that he intended to lay the whole matter before their father's old friend, the county's senior magistrate, within the week, and that he feared, God help him, what Edmund might do once he learned of it. Helena sat very still for a long time, the lantern guttering low beside her, Caesar's grey head resting heavy and warm against her knee, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its terrible certainty, that her husband had not died of an unfortunate fall on a wet road. He had died of what he knew, and of the brother who could not afford for him to tell it. And she had been sitting, for 2 years, in a house his murderer had given her in the careless confidence that she would never think to dig beneath a rose. She did not weep this time. She had wept enough in 2 years to last several lifetimes, and what she felt now was something colder and steadier than grief, something that settled into her chest like the iron box itself, heavy and certain and entirely her own. The magistrate Julian had named was fortunately still living, a widower of some 70 years named Sir Robert Aldous, who had known both Ashby brothers since their boyhood, and who received Helena when she called on him 3 days later, with the iron box in her lap and Prudence beside her for countenance, with the grave courtesy of a man who suspects, from the moment a visitor is announced, that he is about to be asked to do something difficult. He read the papers in silence, twice through, his face growing greyer with each page, and when he had finished, he sat for a long while without speaking, his hand resting flat upon the ledger, as though to hold it down, to keep it from rising up and becoming, all at once, the catastrophe it plainly was. "I knew your husband," he said at last. "I taught him to fish, in this very county, when he was a boy no higher than my knee. I've known Edmund Ashby rather longer than I have known you, my lady, and I tell you honestly that I would have staked my own reputation until this hour on the impossibility of what these pages suggest." "And now?" Helena asked. "Now," he said heavily, "I find that I cannot unread them, nor would I wish to, whatever the cost of believing them. Tenant families do not invent evictions, Lady Ashby. I can have the parish records checked within the week and the bank in London written to, and I think you will find, when both answers return, that they will not contradict your husband's hand." He looked at her with something that was almost pity and almost respect, and settled finally into something closer to resolve. "It will not be quick. These things never are, when a duke is the man accused. But it will be done properly, and it will be done thoroughly, and I give you my word, as I gave your husband mine in spirit if not in fact, that I will not let this rest until it is finished." It took, in the end, 11 weeks. 11 weeks during which Helena returned to the Dower house and continued, with a composure that cost her more than anyone but Prudence ever guessed, to tend her roses and mend her roof, and receive her growing circle of visitors as though nothing at all had changed, while quietly, beneath the surface of that ordinary life, letters travelled to London and parish records were examined, and 2 evicted tenant families, found at last in a neighbouring county where they had gone to seek work, gave statements that matched, line for line, the figures in Julian's hidden ledger. Sir Robert wrote to her twice during those weeks, brief and careful letters that gave away nothing of how the matter progressed, for he was too old a hand at the law to commit hope or despair to paper before either was warranted. But he called on her once in person, on a wet afternoon in early November, and sat with her a long while over tea, saying very little of substance, and she understood, from the simple fact of his coming at all, that he wished her to know she was not facing the weight alone, whatever the outcome of it proved to be. The confrontation, when it came not in the great hall of Marrow Court, but in the Dower house's own restored drawing room, because Sir Robert, with a delicacy Helena had not expected of him, judged that the Duke ought to be given the truth first in private, by the woman he had wronged, before he was given it formally, in public, by the law. Edmund arrived at her door on a cold afternoon in late autumn, summoned by a note from the magistrate that had given him no comfort and a great deal of unease. And Helena received him in the room she had built with her own hands and her own ferocious patience, with Caesar lying watchful at her feet, and the last of the season's damask roses, cut and arranged in a bowl upon the table between them, filling the air with a sweetness that felt, to her, like a kind of vengeance all its own. He looked older than she remembered. He looked, for the first time in the whole of their acquaintance, uncertain. "You sent for me," he said. Under circumstances Sir Robert declined to explain. "I did not send for you," Helena said. "Sir Robert thought it a kindness to let you hear this from me before you hear it from a magistrate's warrant. I'm not certain, now that you are here, that you deserve the kindness, but it has been offered, and I find I do not wish to take it back." She placed the iron box on the table between them, beside the roses, and watched his face as he opened it, watched the colour leave it by slow degrees as he turned the pages, watched his hands, those famously still hands that had never once in 2 years betrayed him by trembling, begin at last very slightly to shake. "Julian found this," she said, "in the last weeks of his life. He buried it here, beneath a stone in this garden, because he trusted no desk in your house to keep it safe from you. He meant to give it to Sir Robert within the week. He never had the chance." She let the silence hold for a long moment before she finished. "I think you know better than I do what happened to that chance, and to him." "It was an accident," Edmund said, but his voice had lost the cold certainty she had spent 2 years learning to dread, and what was left beneath it sounded, for the first time, almost like a man pleading to be believed by himself as much as by her. "Was it?" Helena said. It was not a question, and he understood, from the way she said it, that she did not require an answer, because the eviction papers and the London ledgers and the 2 tenant families now prepared to swear before a court to every shilling of rent they had paid and never seen acknowledged, had already answered every question that mattered, and would go on answering them in rooms far less forgiving than this one, for as long as the law required. He did not confess that night, not in words, though something in his face slipped, briefly, into a kind of bare and naked fear that told her everything words could not have said. He rose after a long silence and crossed to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment that stretched longer than courtesy strictly allowed, looking out at the dark shapes of the rose beds beyond the glass, the very garden his brother had once promised to show his wife and never had the chance to. And when he turned back, his face had recovered some measure of its old composure, though it sat on him now like a coat grown 2 sizes too large. "You have ruined me," he said, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of distant, exhausted recognition, as though he were reading the sentence off a page set before him, rather than speaking it himself. "You ruined yourself," Helena said, "a long while before I had any part to play in it. I have only stopped pretending not to notice." She did not rise to see him out. Caesar lifted his grey head from the hearthrug as the Duke passed, and watched him to the door with the same unhurried, unforgiving attention he might once have given a stranger crossing onto land he had decided was now his own to guard. and Edmund Ashby left the Dower house that evening without once looking back at the garden he had given away to be rid of a woman he had never troubled to understand. Within the month, the formal proceedings had begun in earnest, and within the season, the truth of it had spread through the county with the same speed that her roses once had, until the name Ashby carried, for a time, a weight of scandal that no amount of cold composure could outlast.
Edmund did not hang. The law, in those years, was gentler to dukes than to tenant farmers, and the worst that befell him in the end was disgrace and the loss of the title's good name, and the quiet, permanent exile of a man no respectable house in the county would any longer receive. Which was, Helena thought, watching from a distance she had earned the right to keep, a fitting enough punishment for a man who had built his whole life on isolating others, to find himself, at the last, entirely alone. A year passed. The Dower house, by the following autumn, bore so little resemblance to the ruin Helena had first entered that visitors who had known it in its decay sometimes stopped at the gate, uncertain they had found the right address at all. The roof was whole. The east wing housed a small library, modest but well chosen, gathered slowly from the proceeds of the rose cuttings she still gave away as freely as ever, and the needlework she no longer needed to sell, but continued, for the pleasure of it, to practice. The garden. The garden had become, by general and uncontested agreement throughout the county, the finest private rose garden within 30 miles, the damask in particular sought after by visitors who travelled considerable distances for the privilege of a cutting and an afternoon among its scent. And it was not uncommon, on a fine Sunday, to find the modest drive crowded with more carriages than Marrow Court itself, in its present diminished circumstances, could any longer attract. Helena stood on the terrace one golden evening in late September, the light falling warm and low across the south wall in the particular colour that only the last hour of a clear autumn day can produce, and watched Caesar move with his old, unhurried dignity along the restored path, pausing here and there to investigate some scent among the roses with the patient thoroughness of an animal entirely content with his place in the world. Prudence sat nearby with a glass of cordial and an expression of deep satisfaction, having declared not an hour before that she intended to remain at the Dower house through the winter, since she could not, in conscience, abandon a garden of such quality to face the cold without her supervision. Sir Robert had called that afternoon, as he often did now, ostensibly on matters of business long since concluded, and had stayed for tea, and had left with a cutting of damask wrapped carefully in damp cloth for his own modest garden, and had said, on departing, that he could not recall the last time the county had possessed an address so universally desired, nor one, he added with a small bow that Helena chose to find touching rather than excessive, so deservedly so. Even the Dowager Duchess, Edmund's own mother, a woman whom Helena had known, in the years of her marriage, only as a figure of frozen and formal courtesy, untouched by warmth even at her own elder son's funeral, had come, that summer, unannounced and alone, and had stood for a long while before the south wall, in a silence Helena had not interrupted, and had said at last, in a voice rusted from long disuse, that she had not known her younger son capable of what the courts had proven, and that she had not known, either, until she stood in this garden surrounded by the roses her own mother-in-law had once planted, how much a thing could be lost through simple neglect, and how much, given patience and care it had never asked for, it could yet be restored. She came again in August, and again in September, and had begun, by the second visit, to bring cuttings of her own back to the cold gardens of Marrow Court, where nothing, Helena gathered, had been permitted to grow freely in a very long time. Helena thought of all this, standing on her terrace in the last gold light of the day, and found that the coal she had carried inside her closed fist for 2 long years, the grief held close, hurting no one but herself, had at some point, without her quite noticing the moment of its happening, ceased to burn. It had not vanished.
She did not think grief of that depth ever entirely vanished, nor did she wish it to, for it was, in its way, the last living measure of how deeply she had loved her husband. And she would not have traded it away, even had the trade been offered.
But it had changed its character, somewhere between the digging of the iron box and this quiet evening among the roses, from a wound that consumed to a warmth that sustained. The way a coal, banked properly and given air, ceases to threaten the house that holds it, and becomes instead the thing that keeps it warm through winter.
"You're smiling," Prudence observed, without looking up from her cordial. "It is a rare enough event that I feel obliged to remark upon it." "I was thinking," Helena said, "that he gave me this house to be rid of me." "And see what you have made of his unkindness," Prudence said. "I have always said that the surest way to discover what a woman is truly capable of is to give her nothing and then stand well back." Helena looked out over the garden, the restored arbour, the thriving damask, the long stone path she had cleared with her own hands from beneath a generation of bramble, the old dog moving contentedly among it all, as though he, too, understood that he had finally come to rest in the place he was always meant to be, and thought of the stone marker beneath the largest rose, still in its place, still bearing its small, chiselled flower, no longer hiding a secret, but simply marking, now, the spot where something nearly lost had been given new root and allowed, at last, to grow. Everything grows, she thought, when it is no longer left alone. Not roses only, but grief and courage and the quiet, stubborn dignity of a woman the world had once mistaken for finished. She had been given a ruin to disappear into. She had made of it, instead, the one address in the whole county that everyone, now, wished most to call upon. And the only person who had ever doubted it would come to such an end was the man who had thought, in his coldness, that a woman left utterly alone could only wither, never having understood, as Helena understood now, watching the last light settle gold and unhurried across her roses, that some things root deepest exactly where they are buried and rise again most beautifully in the very ground meant to be their grave.